And so, as we are looking at how government has evolved over time, we've talked about the state of nature and how we are moving into civil societies, why we're moving into civil societies for greater protection and security so that we can evolve. Um, Man began to live in civil societies somewhere around 12,000 BC. And the first type that probably took form of was in families and clans. The first civil societies were extended families or clans. Robert Filmer in Patriarchia, a book he wrote in 1680, believed that the first kings were the fathers of their families, and that the family unit is really a totalitarian state. Then we see the evolution and formation of tribes and villages. Villages and agricultures based on communities began about 9000 BC. The selection of community leaders can be traced around 8000 to 6000 BC. Tribal chiefs or kings held power as a result of heredity, and authority generally passed down from father to son. Or they were warrior kings, that is to say, alpha males or the king of the mountain. We begin to see the formation of cities with laws, commerce, art, literature beginning to form around 4000 to 3000 BC. Social structures begin to develop. You see classes of nobles, priests, free commoners, and slaves. In cities, armies were created to defend or expand one's control of fertile lands or commercial resources, and communities were ruled by kings. Such laws as Hammurabi's Code were developed about this time in Babylon, 1700 BC, and were drafted to maintain order. And some of our first basic forms of law. And these were established to cause justice to prevail in the land and to destroy the wicked and evil. Capital punishment becomes a standard penalty, death. And they are designed so that the strong may not oppress the weak. At least this is, their stated reasons why. We see then the age of kings and empires following this, with the first dynasty of Ur, 2600 BC to 2500 BC. This first dynasty of Ur was defeated by the Akkadian conquerors. We see the Akkadian Empire, 2370 BC to 2215 BC. They were in turn defeated by invaders from the northeast. The Sumerian Empire, 2100 to 2000 BC, where here the king claimed to rule by divine right, and this empire was destroyed by local revolts and invasions from Iran. The Old Babylonian Empire, 2000 to 1530 BC, destroyed by Indo-European invaders from Iran. Egypt's Old Kingdom, 2700 to 2200, and Egypt's New Kingdom, 1560 to 1070. Began a policy of aggressive imperialism, or expanding, and they were destroyed by invasions from sea and economic collapse. They were subsequently ruled by Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. The Hebrew Kingdom, around 1020 BC, the priest Samuel names Saul as nation's first king. King David creates a unified Hebrew kingdom about 1000 to 960 BC, and you may recall in that the story of Goliath. Under King Solomon, 960 to 922 BC, Israel reaches its political zenith. After that, it splits into two kingdoms in 922 BC. The Assyrian Empire, 745 BC, armies recruited throughout the empire and were trained into professional units and were led by seasoned generals. They skillfully combined foot soldiers, charioteers, cavalrymen, and siege engineers. The empire collapsed under the weight of weak rulers and the rage of its subject people. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, 612 BC, they were overwhelmed by Persian armies. The Persian Empire, 549 BC. They unified the entire Near East under one government. They required subjects to pay taxes and provide troops for the imperial army. The king ruled with the assistance of a council of nobles and provincial governors. They in turn were defeated by the Greeks under Alexander the Great. We see the Greek Empire, 330 BC, the Greek city-state of Athens and Sparta, Greek political philosophers, which you know well, I'm sure, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Alexander the Great's empire stretched from Egypt in the west to India in the east. And Alexander the Great's empire collapsed following his death at the age of 32. The next large empire is the Roman Republic, and following that the empire. About 100 BC to 400 AD is our time frame here. Julius Caesar expanded the area under Rome's control to include most of Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. So you're seeing, along with this, let's take a pause here, you're seeing along with this a greater expansion. The ability to expand and imperialize is becoming greater and greater as the civil societies become more organized. But all of these are going to be undermined and brought down by economic factors or political factors within their own, or invaders. They weren't properly prepared against invasion. And here's the case of the Roman Empire, brought down by Germanic tribes and Huns. And so Europe is divided into a number of smaller kingdoms. Next we see Charlemagne's empire, 768 to 1814. His empire included most of Western Europe, but with his death, this led to the division of Europe between the heirs of his sons and invaders from the north, east, and south. We see a unified England develop in 900, in the year 900 to 1066. Alfred the Great began this unification, and by the mid-900s, all England was ruled by one king. This unified unified England fell in 1066 to William the Conqueror, who inherited a well-established political and legal tradition. This leads to feudalism, the age of feudalism, 1000 to 1400 AD. So this is where individuals owed their loyalty to feudal lords or religious authorities. Feudalism was the contractual system of political and military relationships that existed among members of the nobility in Western Europe during the High Middle Ages. Feudalism is characterized by the granting of fiefs, chiefly in the form of land and labor in return for political and military services. The assumption was that all land was owned by a sovereign prince, for example, a king, a duke, a marquis, a count, who held it of no one but God. The prince would then grant fiefdoms to his barons, who pledged military and political support. In turn, barons would make grants to knights, who swore homage and fealty, or fed and supported them out of his pocket. This was essentially an early pyramid scheme, in which the prince would grant fiefs to barons in exchange for the services of knights, who would subdivide their grants in exchange for support. Feudalism began to decline in the 14th century and was abolished in England by statute in 1660. Note, however, that English common law continued to be based on feudal tradition. An uprising of English barons in 1215 led to the signing of the Magna Carta, in which the king had a right to consult with the barons, where the king had to consult with the barons in what some considered the beginning of a constitutional monarchy. The baronial royal council evolved into the House of Lords, or Parliament, And under Edward I's reign, which was from 1272 to 1307, the Parliament included barons, shire knights, and townspeople, with the shire knights and townspeople eventually splitting off and forming the House of Commons. But it was still aristocratic. By the 14th century, the House of Commons began to gain power over the financial resources of the realm, and the king had to request funds from the House of Commons. Well, this is not going to sit well with the kings, and so there's an era of absolutism, 1576 to 1649, which seemed to be a response to the growth of the limits of the states and the monarchs by these representative assemblies, a counter-revolution, if you will. The rulers gradually consolidated their control over feudal vassals through such means as marriage or conquest, thereby establishing larger territorial units, or the nation-states. Eventually, these territorial units would build upon a sense of nationalism. Now, nationalism is the identification with a group of individuals based on a shared sense of loyalty and psychological attachment based on common language, history, culture, and desire for political independence. The monarchs used this growing sense of nationalism to mobilize armies and citizens for defense of their territory. And we have nationalism today. We call it patriotic fervor or pride. Monarchs drew their power from a variety of sources, not just this nationalistic trend. Religion offered a defense of absolutism. The church looked on rulers as divinely ordained, and by its appointment gave them a sacred character. Charles I said, quote, "Kings were the breathing images of God upon earth," end quote. And also he said, quote, "The state of monarchy is the most supreme thing upon earth, for kings are not only God's lieutenants upon earth and sit upon God's throne, but even by God himself they are called gods," end quote. Whoa. Well, Jean Bodin, in the 6 books on the Commonwealth, which he wrote in 1576, and Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, 1651, both supported absolutism as necessary to prevent civil war or a return to the state of nature in the condition of war. So for these philosophers, it doesn't really matter whether God had actually ordained it. They just saw this as a necessary evil for maintaining control.